Today's topic, I will be discussing fostering social interaction in classroom interpreting. First of all, it's important to know that social development is essential for a child's well-being. This is true for both children and adolescents. And that an educational interpreter can have a significant influence on a student's social development. The educational team, therefore, should take into consideration opportunities for social interaction and the development of friends for the deaf and hard of hearing students. Fostering peer interaction. Peer interaction among children and adolescents is important for the following: language development, cognitive development, and social development. Children learn many skills through their interactions with peers that they don't learn with interactions with adults, so these interactions are very important. For example, through interactions with peers, children and adolescents both acquire language and vocabulary that is generally not learned through interactions with adults. Children also learn how to argue, negotiate, and persuade, and they essentially learn this through trial and error when playing with friends at any age. Children also learn how to express themselves without hurting others, whether physically or emotionally. For example, you'll see small children, before they've learned to share, may hit another child to take what they want or just take something without asking. And over time they'll learn that this might be better ways to get what they want, and they'll learn this through those interactions. Children also learn how to resolve conflicts, apologize, and support each other through these interactions. Peer interaction helps establish a foundation for important aspects of a child's emotional development, such as self-concept, self-esteem, and identity. Essentially, through these peer interactions, children learn about themselves and others and will learn this information to help develop a sense of self. This is why it's very important to write social goals into an IEP for a deaf or hard of hearing student if it's an issue. As we've discussed, social skills are essential for a student's overall happiness, self-concept, and learning, and therefore the social learning needs of a student should be addressed by the whole educational team, which includes the interpreter. This is especially important in a school where the majority of the students are hearing and there may only be one deaf or hard of hearing student. For this reason, the deaf and hard of hearing children often experience a sense of social isolation as they have trouble connecting with their peers. So what are some ways to address or resolve the social isolation that a deaf or hard of hearing student might experience? For one, a school can set up a connection through webcams where deaf students at one school can communicate with deaf or hard of hearing students at another school that may not be nearby. Or they could set up these interactions with other deaf adults who may have gone through the same experiences that the student is currently experiencing and can help them understand their social isolation and give some advice. Similarly, the deaf and hard of hearing students can be set up with a deaf mentor who can help that student manage social interactions and learn how to develop friendships and resolve feelings of social isolation. Schools can also teach sign language to the hearing students, especially the direct peers of that deaf student. And if it's not possible to set up a general sign language class, then it's at least very important to teach some sign language to the students that that deaf student might have connected with, maybe some friends that they have developed certain relationships with, to teach them some sign language. Schools can also sponsor the deaf or hard of hearing student to attend a summer camp for deaf students where they can make those friends and those social connections at a summer camp that the rest of the students have access to year-round. And if it's not possible to resolve these feelings, it might be necessary to move the deaf or hard of hearing student to a different program with more social opportunities, perhaps to a different school that might have a deaf program with more deaf and hard of hearing students. Some deaf students do have understandable speech, and this presents some interesting situations for that educational interpreter, because that student might be able to negotiate some social situations independently. The interpreter might be there to provide clarification if either the deaf or hearing student needs help understanding the speech on either side. But the interpreter has some competing goals. The general goal of an educational interpreter is to provide all communication access to all communication for that deaf or hard of hearing student, which means interpreting all interactions, all comments, all conversations. But the interpreter also wants that student to have the opportunity to communicate using their spoken English. Therefore, the interpreter needs to decide which social situations to provide interpreting, when to provide only spoken clarification, or when to remove themselves completely from a social situation to allow the students to socialize independently. It's important that both the deaf and hard of hearing students and their interpreters learn which situations require interpretation and which the student can manage independently, whether the interpreter can notice these situations and have a sense of when to back off, or when the student can voice for themselves and let that interpreter know, I can handle this situation. For those students who use sign language exclusively, they may need help negotiating the rules of how hearing children interact, and those rules and social norms may not be as obvious to the deaf or hard of hearing student as they are implicitly known to the hearing students. Hearing children also might need education about hearing loss and deafness and how to communicate with deaf and hard of hearing peers, whether directly or through the interpreter. And both the deaf and hearing students may need guidance in using an interpreter for communication. Moving on, it's important to discuss the importance of authentic friendships for both children and adolescents. Peers are an essentially important part of academic achievement for children and adolescents. Friends can provide support and encouragement, or they can also be a discouragement or a distraction. Children have reported that they enjoy events more when their friends are present. And it's through interactions with peers that children learn the rules of social interactions, which lay the foundation for social and professional interactions in adulthood. Also, children learn about different beliefs and values by interacting with other peers that helps them develop a sense of their own identity. Friends provide emotional and psychological support, especially important in the adolescent and high school years. And these interactions help students develop problem-solving skills and resiliency. Additionally, friends contribute to the intellectual development of each other, as friends can be very important teachers. All of this points to why it's incredibly important that that deaf or hard of hearing student has the same access to these peer interactions and authentic friendships as their hearing peers. So social events and the role of the interpreter, how the interpreter's role changes when it's not a primarily academic environment. Social interactions help students develop skills in collaboration and leadership, and it's very important that the deaf and hard of hearing students have the same access to extracurricular activities as their hearing peers. But it's very important that the deaf and hard of hearing students discuss with their interpreters what the role of the interpreter should be in these social interactions. In a classroom, for example, academic information will always take priority, and the interpreter should know that. But socially, the student should be the one to really manage the interpretation and determine what is and is not important in those interactions. So, for example, during social events, a deaf student may prefer a different interpreter than the one they have regularly worked with for some events. For example, a student may request an interpreter of the same gender for certain sports activities. Students in social events should be the one to explain to their peers how best to use the interpreter, and they should also be able to explain the role of the interpreter to coaches, referees, and other teachers. Of course, this is all dependent on that student's developmental level and how able they are to address these issues on their own. Younger students might have more difficulty. Deaf and hard of hearing students need to learn which interactions they can manage independently and which require an interpreter. And very importantly, the interpreter must know how to translate slang and kid talk so the deaf and hard of hearing students have access to that same age-appropriate vocabulary that their hearing peers have access to. So, establishing boundaries between the interpreter and the student. Educational interpreters have unique challenges establishing boundaries, as they often work with just one student, especially as compared to classroom teachers who will work with many different students. Boundaries in the situation can be unclear for a number of reasons. For example, an interpreter may be overly helpful because he or she wants the student to be successful. The student, on the other hand, may be very dependent on the interpreter for social interactions and may feel that they can't communicate socially independently without using that interpreter. The interpreter also might believe that the student needs special assistance and might be overly helpful similarly because they think that the deaf student needs that extra help. Also, boundaries can become difficult because the teacher may not know how to work with an interpreter and may unintentionally ignore the student. Or similarly, the teacher may unintentionally isolate the student and the interpreter because the two of them work together. The teacher might direct their focus to the other students and just assume that the student and the interpreter are okay on their own. And along these same lines, that teacher might believe that the interpreter is responsible for the student, which causes a sense of separation between the student and the teacher. That teacher may not feel a sense of responsibility for the deaf student as the teacher does for the rest of the students, because that deaf student has the benefit of working with that interpreter. So how to establish healthy boundaries between the interpreter and the student? For one, the boundaries that the interpreter establishes should align with what behaviors are expected and not allowed from the hearing students. Additionally, the boundary should reflect a student's level of development. For example, elementary school students might need more support, encouragement, or behavior modeling, whereas middle or high school students might be able to function more independently. It's important that the interpreter not take on a parental role in reference to the deaf or hard of hearing student, and the interpreter should make sure to respect the student's parents' right to make decisions for that student. But at the same time, the interpreter should have a good professional relationship with the family of the student, which can include socializing with the family outside of school. The interpreter should maintain a professional role with the student when interpreting, tutoring, and just talking. The interpreter should also be very careful not to become that student's friend, especially if the student struggles to connect with peers. The interpreter might feel a sense of obligation to be the friend of that student who may not be able to make friends with other students. But if this is the case, the interpreter should work with the rest of the educational team to help find alternatives to social interaction. If the students can't make friends in whatever situation currently exists in the school, try to come up with other ways that that student can make friends. Also, the interpreter should respect the student's right to make developmentally appropriate mistakes without adult correction. In other words, the deaf student has an adult nearby at all times, unlike their hearing peers, so the interpreter can feel a sense of almost mothering or parenting to that student and want them to be the most successful and try to fix their mistakes or problems as the interpreter sees them. But the interpreter should allow that student to make the mistakes that their hearing peers are making without having an adult nearby to correct them.